This is lesson 8, and we are covering the period of conflict, the last portion of it, section 4 in the material. Letter H, which is the conflict illustrated by the raising of Lazarus. We'll be looking at pretty much all of chapter 11 in this lesson. Because of the attempts to kill Jesus, Jesus had left Jerusalem and had gone to Perea. See this on the map here. Here's Jerusalem, here's Perea across the Jordan River. Same here. I've got two maps up for a reason we'll see in just a second. And so the leadership at Jerusalem had tried to stone him to death, and Jesus had left there and gone and crossed the Jordan River and gone over into Perea in chapter 10 and verse 40. In chapter 11, Jesus learns of Lazarus' sickness, and this prompts him to return to a little village near Jerusalem. That brings us to question 1, which says, where did Lazarus, Mary, and Martha live? Verse 1 of chapter 11 says, now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Well, so obviously they lived in a little village called Bethany. Depending on which map you look at, which is why I've got both of these maps up here, Bethany is either about 2 miles to the north or to the southeast of Jerusalem. Quite interesting. There's Jerusalem. There's north, a little bit northeast to Bethany. On this map you see Jerusalem here, and then it's southeast to Bethany. Obviously there are different views on that, but common view is that it was between Jerusalem and Jericho on the road that way, and so Bethany would be to the northeast if that's accurate. It's interesting to note that the modern Arabic name of the town is a word or phrase which means home of Lazarus. Question number 2 says, what happened to Lazarus and how did Jesus react? Verses 3 through 15. Well, Jesus received notification that Lazarus was sick, but he told the disciples in verse 4 that this sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Upon reading the text initially, if you've never read the text before and you're not familiar with the account, one may be confused about Jesus' behavior. Jesus said Lazarus would not die, yet it's obvious later that he knew that he would die. Jesus intentionally stayed where he was for 2 more days so Lazarus would die. Then he told the disciples that Lazarus was asleep, and that he, Jesus, needed to go and wake him. Of course, Jesus' intentions were made clear in verses 4 and 15. Verse 4 says, when he heard about Lazarus being sick, Jesus said, this sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. Verses 14 and 15 says that he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. This was a few days later. And then he said in verse 15, and for your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. Question number 3 says, what did Thomas think was about to happen? And it refers to verse 16, which says, then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, let us also go that we may die with him. Due to the recent attempts made by the Jews to stone Jesus to death, Thomas believed that if they went back to Judea near Jerusalem, the Jewish authorities would have them put to death. And that was actually brought up in verses 7 and 8 when Jesus said in verse 7, let us go back to Judea. In verse 8, his disciples said, but Rabbi, a short while ago the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet are you going back? The remarkable thing is that Thomas believed that this is what was going to happen, and yet he made no objection. He was resigned to follow Jesus to the death. Question 4 says, describe the scene when Jesus reached Bethany. Verses 17 through 19. It says, on his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. Lazarus had apparently died pretty much the same day that Jesus learned of him being sick. They would bury people on the same day that they died. Lazarus had been dead and buried for 4 days at this time. It being about a 25-mile trip from Perea to Bethany, it would have taken about 2 days to get there, and then 2 days for Jesus to come back to travel to Bethany. And so that indicates that Lazarus probably died around the same day that Jesus was informed. Traditional Hebrew mourning lasted for 7 days, and during this period friends and relatives would have been present to comfort the family and also express their own grief. So that's what Jesus would have seen when he approached the home and that area where they had buried Lazarus. Question 5 says, describe the conversation between Jesus and Martha. Refers to verses 20 through 27. Well, Martha expressed regret that Jesus had not been there to prevent Lazarus' death. She expressed confidence in the future general resurrection, but she simply did not anticipate that Jesus would raise Lazarus from the dead on this day. In verse 23, Jesus was asking Martha if she believed that he could raise Lazarus from the dead right then. She didn't seem to understand that. Again, she expressed confidence that one day all would be resurrected, but Jesus clarified this obviously later. Question 6 says, describe the conversation between Jesus and Mary. It refers to verses 28 through 34. Well, I'm a bit confused by this question. There was really not a conversation between Jesus and Mary. The text simply reveals that Martha went and told Mary that Jesus was looking for her, then Mary went immediately to find Jesus. The only conversation that's recorded that took place was a statement that Mary made to Jesus when she first saw him. In fact, she said the very same thing to him that Martha had said to him. In verse 34, she said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Mary and Martha were both thinking along the same lines. Neither of them anticipated Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. They only bemoaned the fact that he'd not been there to prevent it. And according to the text, Jesus never gave a direct response to her. He simply asked the people who were with her, where have you laid him? Question 7 says, why do you think Jesus wept at the tomb of Lazarus? Refers to verses 35 through 37. I'll go back to verse 33. It says, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him. I think it was probably a combination of things that caused Jesus to weep. Obviously, he loved Lazarus. That was a factor. But I think Jesus wept because he was looking at the ultimate consequence of sin. Sin brings death. Sin is what brought this whole event on. I think he wept because of the grief he saw in those he loved, all the pain from the loss, again brought on by sin. Question 8 says, how was Mary going to see the glory of God? Well, the text is actually talking about Martha, not Mary, so that must have been a typo. But verses 39 and 40 says, Jesus said in verse 39 to take away the stone, but Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time there is a bad odor, and he has been there 4 days. Then Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? Martha and all those present were getting ready to witness the glory of God when Lazarus was raised from the dead. Question 9 says, what happened when Lazarus came forth from the grave? Verses 41 through 45. I've actually got the text 43 through 46, but I see basically four things. Lazarus came forth. Jesus told the people to unbind his grave clothes. Many of the people present believed. Some of the people went and told the Pharisees what had happened. Beginning in verse 43, it says, "When Jesus had said this, he called in a loud voice, 'Lazarus, come out.' The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, 'Take off the grave clothes and let him go.' Therefore many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done." Question 10 then says, "What fear did the Pharisees and Jewish council have?" Well, they gathered together to discuss this in verse 47, and they expressed their fear in verse 48. Reading those two verses, it says, "Then the chief priests and the Pharisees called the meeting of the Sanhedrin. 'What are we accomplishing?' they asked. 'Here is this man performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation.'" So there's their fear expressed. Due to the fact that they don't even seem to consider that this movement might die out on its own, this seems to be a subtle admission that Christ's miracles were genuine. They were saying that if they didn't destroy Christ, if they simply left him alone, everyone was going to believe in him. Next week's class covers basically the rest of chapter 11, which is only a few verses, 5 or 6 verses. I don't recall exactly how many. All of chapter 12 and most of chapter 13. It will cover section 5, which is called the period of crisis. It will cover section 6, portion A, section A. The period of conference is section 6, which covers chapter 12, verse 36 through chapter 17, verse 26. But we'll only cover the A section of that, which is called the transition from chapter 12, verse 36 to chapter 13, verse 30.